I've been running the Oyster card system for 6 years, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening with the Oyster card, what has happened and what is happening in the coming years. You're all here in London. I know there are many people here from outside London, but I'm not going to waste too much time telling you about Transport for London. Suffice it to say that if you move in London, you're probably moving on something that either we manage or we provide. There are very few services in London that are not run by Transport for London. So we run the bus system, the tube system, we manage the road network, we run the light railways, and so on. I won't bore you too much with it. But let me tell you a little bit about Oyster and where we are with it. Oyster's been around for about 10 years now. Launched in 2003 to the public, launched to our staff a bit before that. The vast majority of ticketed travel on buses, about 96%, is now on Oyster. There's a very small proportion of paper tickets that are still being issued on buses or paper tickets issued by other parties that are being accepted on buses. On the tube, the number is a bit smaller, and that's largely because we accept tickets from the National Rail network, the commuter rail network in London. But by and large, our ticketing has moved over to Oyster. Over the years, we've tried to integrate and tried to use the Oyster card to integrate transport services in London as well. And the big sort of outlying element of the transport network in London was the commuter rail network. It stood outside Oyster for a long time, but finally, in 2010, we integrated the commuter rail network with Oyster as well. So, that's what the tube map looks like. That's basically all the 275 tube stations on that map. But if you look at a map of what Oyster covers now, the map looks more like that. Huge extension south of the river, which is where the commuter rail network's more dense. So overall, there are 300 national rail stations that have also now become part of Oyster, 652 stations altogether, in addition to the 8,500 buses that we run. 3,000 Oyster readers on National Rail, that's part of the 23,000 readers altogether. And we process about 14 million transactions every day. Looking at National Rail, since the launch in 2010, we had a small sliver of National Rail services that were on Oyster before then, which is what you see on the left-hand side there. But there's been a very sharp growth in the use of Oyster on National Rail to the point where we're processing 2.5 million transactions, 2.5 million journeys, not transactions, but 2.5 million journeys on National Rail every week now. First thing, £500 million in revenue on National Rail that's been processed through the Oyster system in the last 2 years. But more importantly, and this is a point that's worth making, it's in many people's business cases about smart cards, but we actually have real evidence of this. Since we launched Oyster on National Rail, the traffic has gone up on National Rail. And you can look at that. Traffic goes up everywhere. But you can look at the differential increase in traffic on National Rail compared to what's happened on the underground. You can also look at the differential increase in traffic on National Rail compared to those locations where Oyster has not been implemented. And looking at those factors, there's quite an extensive piece of research that's been done on this. 5.5% to 6% journey growth on National Rail, resulting from Oyster pay-as-you-go. That translates, if you translate that into money, that translates into additional revenue coming into the rail network of about £80 million per year. It's hard to imagine what sort of investment you would have to put in to get that sort of revenue by any other means. So it's a remarkable success, and I can sit here and gloat all day long, but there are still many challenges that we face up to every day. One of these challenges, there are many of these kind, but let me just focus on one. Since we launched Oyster in 2003, we've been issuing cards at the rate of £500,000 a month, and you would think, would you not, that at some stage the market would be saturated. There are only 7.5 million residents in London. We've now issued 51 million cards, right? And we still issue 500,000 cards a month. That pace has not slowed down ever. That 500,000 a month, 500,000 to 600,000 a month is the rate at which we've been going for at least the last 6 years. So the question is, why? And you'll see here that the bulk of these cards are actually what we would call dormant, as in they've not been used in the last month. The proportion of cards that are actually live, which is they're being used on a day-to-day basis, that number it's growing. You can't see that clearly on the chart. It is growing. but it's growing at a very small rate. What's been growing much more is the proportion of dormant cards. So the striking thing is that only 1 in about 14 cards that's issued adds a new customer to our network. The rest of it is just churn. That includes many people in this room who are here for this conference, probably got an Oyster card. At the end of the conference, they're gone. Now, to us, that's a bit of income, so I don't complain about it. But having said that, the task of equipping you with an Oyster card when you arrive into London, the task of providing the network for you to go and top it up, is all an expense. It's an expense that we pay for, but eventually you pay for it, and our customers pay for it. So a few years ago, we adopted a kind of objective for ourselves, where if we could, we should seek to speed up our customers' journeys through our system. And that means cutting out steps that don't actually involve motion. And ticketing is one of those steps. Now, it's interesting for somebody who lives by ticketing to say ticketing is an unnecessary step, but it is. People travel because they want to travel. People don't travel because they want to buy a ticket. It's the other way around. They buy a ticket because we make them buy a ticket. And that process of ticket selling ends up being an expensive thing to do. So why is that the case? You have to go back and look at this whole issue from first principles. Despite the very visible success of Oyster, there are some genuine challenges that we face. One of those challenges is down to the very business model that we run. So that's a typical underground station, ticket windows. People queue up at the ticket windows, and that's how they get their tickets or the top of their Oyster cards. There are obviously machines. There are off-system networks as well. But that model of revenue collection is not very different from what we would otherwise recognize as a bureau de change. Essentially, what we tell you, and what every public transport system tells you around the world, is you may have the money that buys you everything else in your pocket. But when you arrive at our border, and we really are a republic of our own, when you arrive at our border, you've got to change your money for our money. And if you don't do that, you can't travel. Sounds odd, but that is the reality of public transport all around the world. I don't know of any system that doesn't do this. So if you want to go and do something about this whole process of ticket selling, especially the cost of ticket selling and the hassle of ticket selling, we've got to go back and look at this from first principles. And I'm sort of an amateur historian as well, and I sort of delve into industrial history quite a bit. So we look back at London alone. Where did ticketing come from? We have a wonderfully documented history of London transport. So where did ticketing come from? Because while it's very natural for us to think about ticketing and public transport together, it's natural because it's been around for a long time. But a long time does not mean forever. And there was a world before tickets were invented. It may be hard to imagine that, but such a world did exist. And that world consisted of people paying their fares in cash. So if you go back to the 1860s and before in London, we had horse-drawn buses. We had quite a few of these. They were carrying millions of journeys even back in those days. And the process of fare payment on those buses was very simple. There was a fare advertised on the back of the bus. You got on, you paid the conductor, and that was that. There was only one fairly major fault with this whole process, which is the money wasn't getting accounted. And if it wasn't getting accounted, it was being stolen. There's wonderful records in the 19th century of the amount of pilferage that went on with these buses. By some accounts, I'm not kidding, by some accounts, 2/3 of the money was being pilfered. And that resulted in the bus companies going bankrupt successively all through the 1850s and 1860s, go bankrupt, get reorganized, get consolidated. And there's quite large bus companies that came up as a result. The London General Omnibus Company was one of those. And they finally got around to thinking, well, how do we tackle this problem of pilferage? And the answer was the invention of a ticket. That's where tickets came from, right? They were a means of accounting for money. And from that point on, when you got on a bus, the conductor would issue you a ticket, and every now and then, a revenue inspector would board the bus, and if every passenger on the bus did not have a ticket, the passenger got fined, and the conductor got fined, right? So that's where tickets came from. Now, it's a wonderful thing to invent something of this kind, because people then get very innovative about what they can do with tickets. And so we had a huge growth of weekly passes and monthly passes and fares based on distance and so on and so forth. And frankly, that's all well and good, because that is what people should have done with an innovative product in their hand. And certainly in London, we have been very inventive about this. So the tickets came along first in the 1870s, at about the same time in London and Paris. In the 1920s, actually in 1921, we had the first passenger-operated ticket machine in London, where you could walk up to a machine and buy a ticket by just dropping coins into it. In the 1960s, magnetic stripe ticketing was invented for gates in London. And then we were among the first systems, not quite the first, but among the first systems to implement smart cards. So there's been this huge growth of ticketing and all the various things you can do with ticketing. But none of that takes away from the basic fact that what we sell today has none of the attributes of what one would call a ticket. We sell a journey. You get in some place, we collect a payment off you, and you're allowed to travel. We don't sell on the basis that you have an assigned seat or an assigned train. That's what happens in airlines. But we don't do that. All we want is a small payment in exchange for the journey that you're making. And so we started going back to first principles to think about exactly this problem. So with Oyster cards, we have a system where, very elaborate system, but a system where the value sits on your card. We have a billing engine inside the reader that computes the fares. It looks up the appropriate fares data, and that's how you get your fares paid. Once you've got the fares paid, a copy of your data is sent back to our back office for accounting purposes. But the card is the actual source of truth. That's the only place where the value is genuinely true. And what you're trying to do in your back office system is mirror what's happening with the card. Now, we looked at this about 5 or 6 years ago, and we said, okay, for 150 years, we've had to invent things that we could call tickets. But now, there are other industries doing things and providing products that may work as a substitute for ticketing. And that's where the idea of working with contactless bank cards, EMV is Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. It's the sort of code name for contactless bank cards that are issued. And there are many of these that are issued in London. So we started looking at this for 2 reasons. One is that obviously it's a form of payment that you already carry in your pocket. Most people in London, if you have an account with Barclays, you have a contactless card in your pocket. You may not know it, but you do. And in a few years' time, as all the other banks catch up with their issuance, you will have a contactless card in your pocket. So for the first time in 150 years, you will have a product issued by someone else that allows you to pay a fare on the transport system. And the beauty of this for us is, the entire network becomes simpler. There is no processing logic required at the reader that requires the readers to know fares. There's no transport-specific data anywhere. And then all the card processing is actually done centrally. And at the end of the card processing, the money comes straight out of your bank account. And that's where the fun really starts, because if the money comes out of your bank account, we just become a merchant. We become a merchant like any other merchant. If you go to a supermarket, you don't need to do anything special before you arrive there to be able to buy your groceries. If you go to a hotel, you don't need to do anything special to pay the fare for the room. If you go to a coffee shop, likewise. So why are we special? All we've got to do is collect a payment. And so that's what we're doing with EMV. Now, it's a better proposition for customers. Pay for transport just like you pay for everything else. There's no need to get a card, no need to top it up. For those of you who've arrived into London just for this conference, you wouldn't want to wait in the queue at Heathrow Airport, and you wouldn't need to. If you've got a card in your pocket, just use it. For us, as a transport operator, it ends up being a cheaper method of collecting revenue, because we don't have to provide the paraphernalia that goes along with revenue collection. It's an easier system to manage. I'll tell you, after 10 years of running Oyster, I'm a big advocate of everything with Oyster, but I also know the shortcomings of Oyster. If I have to give a refund back to a customer, it's a real task to get that refund back to that customer, because if the card is the only source of truth, I have to figure out where I expect to see the card next. send a refund there, and hope to get that customer. Otherwise, I'm stuck. If you have an account-based system, none of that is an issue because you send the money back to the account from where it came. So it's easier to deal with exceptions, and it provides much more flexibility for new fares policy. So to the extent that we may want to introduce new fares policy in the future, all you've got to do is to make a change at one server, not at 23,000 readers across the entire estate. That's the overall architecture. I'll leave that slide. You can look at it. But essentially, our architecture consists of 5 vertical boxes. We've got the front end, which consists of the readers and the gates and the ticket machines, which are out on the transport network. Data comes from the front end into our security engine, which is where we make sure that it's sort of properly security verified. It goes from there into a risk engine, where we assess the nature of this customer that we're dealing with and what actions we may need to take in terms of risk. From that point on, it goes off into a fares and aggregation engine, where all this data gets assembled because we have individual taps coming in. The taps need to get assembled to make journeys, and the journeys then need to have fares applied to them. We have a system of daily capping, so that would need to come in as well. With this system, we will also introduce weekly capping. So the entire market for people who are buying short-term tickets should vanish into direct payments by cards. And at the end of the value chain, you get into all the actions around customer service, displaying data for customers, taking customer service actions, and the like. At the bottom, I've written out there, that front end, including the security engine, is being delivered by Cubic for us. That back end is something that we're developing internally within Transport for London. So when does this all happen? We're expecting to go live this year on buses, and buses first because they have a simpler fare structure and they allow us to deal with things more simply. Next year, we'll go live on the rest of the transport network, and that's when all the daily capping and weekly capping will come in as well. But the entire estate that is currently Oyster enabled will be enabled for open payments as well. So I'll stop there. We have active discussions going on with other cities around the world, including with some of you here. We have active discussions going on with transport operators in the UK about extending this kind of model to all of the UK. And one of the advantages of this whole model is that if you chose to accept something different at the front end, so let's say like in the US, there's a big movement to accept government ID cards for travel. Well, not a problem. We can accept anything at the front end and process the fares in exactly the same manner. All we need is a unique ID coming through the front end. So a lot of potential to expand from where we are right now. And there are active discussions